latter part of the afternoon. So hopefully, if you're here for Less is More, using the Shrink to Grow strategy with Mary Byers. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
All right. Excellent. So Mary is going to share a whole bunch of really good information with us today. Really glad to have her back. She was a keynote featured speaker at AAMSE a few years ago. Some of you may remember that session. I remember it well because it actually helped us at my association think differently about strategic planning, and actually ended up had the pleasure of working with Mary on our most recent strategic plan. But many of you may also know Mary because of her books, The Race for Relevance and The Road for Relevance, which are among ASAE's bestsellers. And so we're really excited to have her with us today. How many of you had a chance to hear Mary speak earlier this afternoon? Wow, look at that. It's like groupies. That's awesome. Well, good. I'm assuming that went well because you're back. And so without any further ado, I'm going to let Mary share all her wisdom with us.
Thank you, Steve. I paid everybody that was in the earlier session to follow me to this session, so don't be too impressed with that. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here with you today. I would love for this to be an interactive program. I'm actually going to teach you a process that you can take back to your associations. I'll set you up and let you know the situations in which you might want to use it. But I'm also going to tell you that you know your association better than I ever will. You know the ins, you know the outs, you know the players, you know the personalities. So this is a process that you can follow, but it's also an adaptable process. So if there's pieces of it that aren't comfortable for you or they don't make sense for your organization, it's very flexible. The shrink to grow strategy is very counterintuitive. In associations, when we are looking to enhance value or to increase our value proposition, the natural tendency is to immediately go for more. And we think that if we want more products, more programs, more services equals more value, and if we have more value, then we have more members. But the problem with that is twofold. If the more that you're adding doesn't have meaning or relevance for your members, it doesn't matter how much you do. It still doesn't matter. So the more that you have has to be part of your value proposition. And your value proposition has to be strong enough so that you can speak it in 2 sentences or less. And the typical association will say, well, we do education, and we do certification, and we do advocacy, and we do this, and we do that, and we do a salary survey. And your potential members, their eyes just glaze over because we have communications clutter. So part of this is helping you narrow your product and service focus so that you can speak your value proposition articulately. And I'm going to give you a $100 question to go back and ask. And if you can't answer it, you want to start with this piece first. If you can't answer it, this process may actually help you get to an answer. And here's the question. How do you help members work less stressfully, more profitably, and more productively? How do you help members work less stressfully, more profitably, and more productively? Because members will give you their money if you help them do something better, with a higher profit margin, or less stressfully. You've got to make their lives better somehow, because otherwise, why spend time or money with you? So if you have and go back and pull your member benefits brochure and take a look at what's in there. One of the clients that I was working with had 101 reasons to join such and such association on their webpage. I'm going to tell you that potential members probably couldn't even name 2 of those because 101 is just way overwhelming. So you have to get to the point where you can tell members why they should join you in 2 sentences or less. If you can't do that, either your value proposition isn't strong enough, you aren't articulating it well enough, or you've got a problem with communications clutter. So the situations where you would want to use this process are if you've got communications clutter and you want to narrow your program and service offering. Another situation in which you might want to use this if you have a sudden change in resources, or as many associations back in 2008, if you had a change in fortune. The economy tanked, a lot of associations lost members, their dues revenues went down. I know that the Associated General Contractors of St. Louis actually went through this process in around that time period because they realized that they had fewer resources, and it's insane to think you can deliver the same value and the same number of programs and services when you actually have fewer resources. So if you have a change in your fortune or a change in your circumstances, you may want to use this process. The American Optometric Association used this in a different way. This was created actually to help you figure out what to let go of. It's to help you narrow your program and services. But they flipped it. Rather than going through the whole evaluation process and looking for things to get rid of, they actually decided to focus on the most highly ranked programs and services because they know that members are attracted to excellence. And what they wanted to do was to find out what members valued the most and then to focus their resources on those things that members valued the most. The Pareto principle tells us that 80% of member value comes from 20% of your programs and services. 80% of your member value comes from 20% of your programs and services. So my question is, what is that 20% for you? And a lot of times we don't know. We can guess. We can, maybe make a case for where we think that value comes from. But this is a process to really help you on that value. The other thing that this process does is it forces you to make decisions about what is highly rated and what's not over a number of categories. So the interesting thing to me is that something that is related to your mission might rank really high on the relatedness to mission category, but it might rank really low on whether or not it makes money for your organization. And so by ranking items across a number of categories, you get kind of an average rating so that you're not just ranking it on one thing versus the other, the percentage of participation or the relatedness to mission. So essentially what it does is it just gives you a process. And I'm actually going to walk you through this process so that you can go back and do it in your own associations. But again, you know more about your members and you know more about what makes you unique, and so you may need to do a little bit of tweaking. So Steve, if you want to do handouts, anybody that's in back, we've got seats here. You've got new friends here. You're welcome to come up and join us. If you've got a seat by you, would you just raise your hand so that if you guys want to come grab a seat? All right, good deal. So essentially, when you get your handout, if you will take a look at this sheet here, I'm actually going to walk you through the process on how to do this. The instructions are here so that when you get back to the office, you have a template and a process to use. If you get stuck when you get back to the office, I would be more than happy to have a quick conversation with you and help you through this process. Let me give you a couple more tenets kind of before we get started. The best case scenario is to do this for your entire organization top down. If you're a large medical society or you're a national organization, that can be a pretty lengthy, tedious process. So some individuals we know have actually chosen to do this by department. So the communications department goes through the process, the advocacy department goes through the process, the meetings department goes through the process. You can also take this and apply it to a specific program or service or a meeting. I had one individual tell me that we had a meeting, their annual meeting was sort of on the decline in terms of participation. So they took everything they do at their annual meeting and put it into this matrix. And they were looking specifically for what are the things we absolutely want to keep because they have high member value, and what are the things maybe that we want to get rid of because they have low member value. So let me walk you through this process, and I'm going to ask you to hang with me because I have to sort of get to the end of the description before I can really take questions, because you have to sort of see the whole thing and how it works together. The one thing I will tell you is this is an objective subjective. It's subjective going through this. So how you would fill this out and how somebody else in the association might fill it out would be different, potentially. But that's kind of an interesting piece of this because it starts conversations that you might not have. And I've had some groups tell me that they had the board do it, and then they had their staff do it. And then they compared. Now, the downside of that is a lot of times your board doesn't fully understand all of your programs and services. So you're asking them to evaluate things they don't fully have direct experience with. The other thing, if you do this internally, I will tell you that we have a tendency, if you work in the communications department, you have a tendency to think that the communications department is the most important in the association. And if you work in advocacy, that's the most important in the association. So doing it like with a senior staff or with different representatives, it leads to some interesting conversations. So the way you start is in the first column, you write down all of the programs and services that your association does. So anything that you want to evaluate. In the case of Associated General Contractors, when they did this, they wrote down anything that took staff time. So that included committees, it included board meetings, it included anything that they did, and they ended up with 133 items on that list. So from the get-go, all of a sudden you can see why you're tired by the end of the week, because there's a lot of things that go on in your associations. Some groups will choose just to do only programs and services, so things that they don't charge back to the association, like committee prep or meeting minutes and stuff like that. Don't go on here. So it's up to you. Again, it's a very flexible vehicle. So all of your programs and services go in this first column. And then we do a forced choice ranking. And forced choice is by design. What that means is you can only rank a couple of items a 5, which is the highest rating, and then you have to also rank some a 1, which is the lowest rating. And that's by design, and the reason for that is we have a tendency to be really nice, and so we give everything a 3, 4, or 5, and this forces us to say, okay, when we're comparing things, this is a 5 and this is a 1. And it forces us into making decisions, which sometimes it's easier not to have to do. So the example that I have up here is from a bar association. And I asked them just to throw 6 things up here because I can do the math on 6, make it easier. And obviously this is going to be different for your medical association. And part of the reason I chose a non-medical thing is just so that you can see that it doesn't matter if you're dental or realtors or who you are. You can use this matrix. So they Common Pleas Court Committee, Law-Related School Education Committee, their annual tennis outing, Past President's Dinner, Bench Bar Conference, Ask the Attorney. So these were the 6 for the example that we used. What you do is you take the number of items that you've placed on your sheet and you divide by 5. So to make the math easier here, let's say there were 10 programs and services on your sheet. You divide by 5, and your rating quotient is 2. And what that means is you can give 2 items a 5, and you also have to give 2 items a 1. And then you can go back and give 2 items a 4. You give 2 items a 2, and then whatever's left over, it gets a 3. What makes this an interesting exercise from my perspective are the categories that you use up here. So in this particular case, they use the relatedness to the mission, the life cycle position, and when you get back to your office, I know you're going to have a question about life cycle position, so let me explain that. If you took marketing in college, you may remember that there's a life cycle curve, and at the beginning is where you're introducing and you're building momentum, and then you get to the top of the curve and you've actually hit your peak, and on the back end is when you're in decline. And no offense, but a lot of annual meetings have already hit their peak, and they're on the decline. And if they're not refreshed or reworked or reconfigured, they will continue to be in decline. So the life cycle position, you may choose to give the ones to something that's new and still holds promise. And the fives would be the ones that, the fives would be the ones that are new and holds promise. The ones, which is your lowest ranking, would be the things that are in decline. So that's what life cycle position means. If that sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher to you, like wah, 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 take that category out. That's the beauty of this. You can make up your own categories. So if there's something that's more meaningful, a metric that you use internally, you can substitute it for that. Percentage of members use. Take a look. You know, your annual meeting in that category, if you've only got 8 or 9 or 10% of your members using that, it's probably going to be a 1. Now, relatedness to mission, it might be a 5, but on the category of the percentage that are used by the members, it may receive a lower ranking. Financial performance. Are we making money on this or are we losing money? So if you're in the black, that's going to be your 5s. And if you're losing money, that's going to be your 1s. And this is where things get a little interesting because something that is very related to your mission might be a 1 in financial performance. Or something that's related to your mission might also be a 5. So this is where you start getting kind of the complexity of different topics across the way. You had a question. Great question. What time frame do you look at? My suggestion would be you look back at least a couple of years. If you've got data for 5 years so that you can start to see a trend, you might want to pull that. And that also raises another point here. There's going to have to be some data involved here before you can start ranking some of these, and this is where your accounting department or your financial department can get involved. Effective use of human capital, again, I know that's a little subjective, but let me give you an example there. Let's say you do an annual golf outing, and it's all your staff works on for 2 months before the golf outing. So is that an effective use of human capital? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on your organization. If everybody loves it and you make a lot of money in your golf outing, then maybe it's an effective use. If you could be using that to do other stuff, whether it's refreshing your meeting or advocacy or outreach, then maybe it's going to be lower. Available elsewhere. I love that question because if there's someplace else that your members can get it, and someplace else sometimes that they can get it easier, less expensively, more quickly. In one program that comes to mind for me back in the 1960s, if you were a dentist, often you joined the American Dental Association for their malpractice insurance, and so it was basically golden handcuffs because that's where your insurance came from and you got it there cheaply. Now, you can go online and go to select quote, and within 30 seconds you can get 5 competing providers that will provide you. So in this particular case, it is available elsewhere to members. In a lot of cases, it's available less expensively to members. So that's an example of where it might rank low versus high. And then would we start today? That's the other one I love because there are so many legacy programs and services that you're doing, and you continue to do them because you've always done them or because it was a beloved past president that started the program. And we have a lot of programs that get momentum and then that president leaves, and so the very passionate person that was driving that program is no longer involved, and so it's not a program that we would start today, although it was a program that we started 15 years ago or 30 years ago or whatever the case may be. So essentially what you do is you go through this whole process column by column, and you do your 5s, and then you do your 1s, and then your 4s and your 2s, and you come back with your 3s. And you fill this whole matrix out. And I'm going to show you one that we've actually filled out, but I want to pause and I want to take questions. Any other clarifying questions here? Okay, so this next one is actually for a realtor group. And again, you can use this regardless of the industry that you're working in. So here's what they had: their annual awards program, charity of choice, the forms and contract library, their leadership academy, their lockbox system. And each category, and this was a real live association that did this for me. So these numbers for them meant something. So percentage of members use multiple listing service. That's what you know realtor associations for. That's kind of their stock and trade. So no surprise there that that's a 5. This one, the forms and contract library, was also a 5 because we're talking about member value. And in this particular case, the number of a percentage of members that use it is kind of an indication of where some of the value is for them. So the managing broker outreach program was the lowest on the percentage that members use, and their leadership academy. So this is how we can have conversations. So a leadership academy, in many cases, associations are raving over their leadership academy. It's building young leaders. It's wonderful. But then we also have to start taking a look at what kind of staffing it takes and how much money it takes for the association and who is it helping. Maybe it's helping the association to develop future leaders, but is it actually developing value proposition for members? And that's where we can start having some of these trickier conversations. So, the Leadership Academy didn't do very well in terms of the percentage that members use, but it did higher in available elsewhere because it's not available elsewhere for those individuals. Yes? In this particular case, it was only the executive director, and we were doing it for example purposes. So if you had, and this is an interesting exercise too, you can give this whole worksheet and have staff do it privately, and then you get together and you go through the numbers and you see where, and so you can do like an aggregate dump of what everybody said.
How do you know that the numbers that staff put to it would be the same numbers the members would put to it?
You don't. You don't. I just had one individual that asked me, is there a way to match this with the member survey that they're doing? And I told them I think there probably is, but the member survey has to match everything that's going to be up here for you to be able to dump that down in there. Because there's no right or wrong way to do this, you could have a member services committee do this. You could ask a randomly selected group of 100 members to do it, and then you can, dump their numbers in there, because it is kind of an interesting, would staff and members rank these the same way? Not necessarily. So in this particular case, we know that in an Excel file, and I have this available. If you want to email me and you want the Excel file already done, you can just email me and just put matrix in the subject line and I'll send it to you. And I don't take responsibility for any problems that are in the Excel file because I am not an Excel guru. So just for whatever that's worth. But you can see that the numbers do work and they do add up. So in their particular case, their multiple listing service was their highest rated, and their lockbox system was their highest rating. So in their case, they know that they're going to hang on to those no matter what. In this particular case, it also happens to be that it does reflect what members they're going to the association for the MLS and for their lockbox system. The lowest ranked items were the realtor store, which is the realtor gear, and the Leadership Academy and the Charity of Choice. So they actually had a tie for those two. So here's where I think this gets interesting. You start having conversations about this now. And I'm not picking on leadership academies, but in this particular case, it happens to be one of their lower ranked items. So what you do is you start asking, why are we doing this? Yes, Dan.
So, Mary, you mentioned with having a committee look at it or sending out to the membership that it seems like if you sent this to the committee, you're sending this to people who are very interested
Great
in
point.
the association. Is it better to send it out to a random sample of the membership?
I probably wouldn't do that. First of all, you're not going to get all of them back. Second of all, it's really complicated to explain, and so you're going to have people doing different things at a different time. If I were going to do it with members, maybe I would bring them together for a task force meeting so that you can explain the process to them. I've had groups that actually lock people in the room and don't let them come out until they've completed this whole process. So they really have to wrestle together on where the 5s or 1s are. There's no right way to do it. But the other thing is somebody has to know what all this stuff is. So here's internally where it gets kind of interesting too. I've had people say to me, well, we've had our education people and our certification people and our advocacy people at the table, and we're all sharing our numbers, and then we get into some little tiffs regarding, I gave that a 5, why would you give it a 2? But it starts conversations you would never have otherwise, and I think that's where part of the value is. If I had a large group of staff members doing it, I think I would ask them to do it individually ahead of time before they came, and then I would put all of their numbers into one Excel file so that you end up with that last column really is the most important column as far as I'm concerned. So then you ask the question, why are we doing these low-rated items? Why are we still doing this? I was working with an agricultural group, and they had 3 things that were that were rated really, really low compared to everything else. And I said, why are you doing these? They were programs that had been initiated by past presidents, and the past presidents were still involved in the programs. So there was a little bit of kind of courtesy and sentiment that was keeping those going. And I said, you know what, I would be willing to bet if your past presidents knew that there were only 3 of them participating, they would even encourage you to get rid of them. So it's a way to start a conversation that you wouldn't normally have. As I mentioned, the American Optometric Association flipped it, and they looked at the things that got the highest ratings. And then they said, how can we put more energy and dollars and expertise into these, because we know that across the board they're helping us reach our goals in many, many areas. How can we make those even better and even stronger? And so that's a different way to look at it, but it's still a conversation starter. And that's what I think this process does, is it actually starts conversations that you wouldn't have otherwise. So are there questions on how you move through this? Yes.
My question is more about, so just take, for example, the leadership academies that you were talking about. So we don't have very many positions go through it each year.
Right.
But it's our pathway to leadership. It's our new, younger positions that we're engaging. So that's part of our larger mission is to get those. So how would that fall in here? Or how would you make sure, I don't want to devalue that one, but I see what you're saying about the sense of participation.
So because this process is flexible, you don't have to live by what you learn here. Now, if you go through the whole process and you change nothing as a result of it, then you could argue that it was a wasted effort. So some associations will say, we're going to do this, and we're going to eliminate 10% of our program and service offerings, or we're going to eliminate 20%, and they give themselves a number ahead of time. Some will go through it, and they'll go, oh, well, that was a nice little exercise. The end. And they'll decide not to make any changes. And that's okay, too, because I think it's better to go through the process and at least have some awareness than not to go through the process at all. The Leadership Academy question, you may say it ranks low on a lot of these categories, but it is helping us with our strategic plan. And if that is part of your larger initiative and it's important to the association, but you have to be careful with that, because I have heard volunteer leaders be able to tie everything back to the strategic plan in some way, shape, or form. Having the mentoring program helps us with membership recruitment and retention, and that's one of our initiatives. So you have to be really careful that it doesn't become an excuse. So you have to have awareness of what your own strategic plan is. And then you have to have but then again, if it's helping you, if the Leadership Academy is helping you achieve, but I will also tell you, there are a lot of leadership academies that are taking a lot of time and a lot of money, and they have a very, very few number of individuals that are going through. If you have a membership of 140,000 and only 20 people are benefiting from that, you have to stop and think about that. And if it's taking a staff member half their time to get the leadership, you have to think about that. So part of it is the broader conversation about what's going to make the biggest difference for the association. And I'm not picking on leadership academies because I've seen many done well. But here's the other thing. If something comes up low in your score, I think it's an opportunity to ask questions. One of those questions is there another way we could be doing this? Is there a potential partner that we could be doing this with? So maybe if you're a state society and you have a leadership academy and the state next to you has a leadership academy, maybe you join forces. And maybe they host it 1 year and then you host it 1 year. Or maybe you do it jointly together the whole time. There's more than one way to change a program or service. What other questions can I answer for you about the process? Yes?
I'm just thinking about that. You could change out related to submission to related to strategic plan.
There you go. So thank you.
This is more germane.
The to be determined, that's the column that you get to fill in on your own. And so maybe in your case, that column is relatedness to the strategic plan. I'm curious, are there categories that you think would be beneficial that aren't up here? What are some other things you could measure on, or knowing yes?
Well, I would say if it's a state's realtor society, they probably want to include the advocacy program as one. It's perceived very highly by the homeowners, but isn't perceived by the staff as being as highly.
And I think that kind of goes into the effective use of human capital, but it also could be relatedness to value proposition. Is this helping us with our value proposition? The tricky thing about advocacy is everybody wants it, but nobody wants to pay for it. And they all get the benefit of it. Are there other categories that you can think of that would be? Yes?
I would want to know if it was newsworthy enough, because obviously I would want to get more members. So if it's a certain program that news outlets or certain institutions can pick up on, that would be beneficial to get our name out there, our specialty out there.
Okay. So in this particular case, newsworthiness might be something that would be beneficial for your group to use, but it might not mean anything, to another association. The thing that you have to be careful, though, is the categories have to be well enough defined that you can make some decisions about that's a 5 and that's a 1. And they also need to be hard measures, too, because otherwise we get into this, well, we'll just keep doing everything. So there is some flexibility here, but I would discourage you from getting rid of all the categories and putting all your own categories in, because I think part of the benefit here is that these are measures where the program and service offering, it makes a difference in terms of what's beneficial and what's not. So I'm curious, where would you get resistance if you went back and said to your staff, we're going to do this, or if you said to your board, we're going to do this? What would be some of the complaints that you heard? Yes, thank you. So if you're going to do this process, if you can tell people nobody will lose their job, that's a good thing. Now, I will say that I know some associations that have used this process when they've had a change of fortune and they've had to make some decisions about headcount reduction, They've wanted to make the reduction in the places that were less, not performing as well. So if you can say that, say it, but don't say it if you can't abide by it. So absolutely, one of the fears is I might lose my job. And so therefore, it's I don't want to participate, or I don't want to be honest about it. What else? What other resistance would you get? Absolutely, territorialism from the department, and that's why I said you can also use this by department. So maybe you give your communications department, and then what that does is it gives your communication department permission, and so I think that's a really important word here. I think this is a permission-giving tool. I think it's a conversation starter. But you ask each of your departments to go through, and you say to the communications department, list all of the things you do, and then I want you to go through and I want you to measure. And then the things that are not being, that have the lowest score, why are we continuing to do them? I've worked with some groups that have given up, they have a leadership newsletter that went out to their leaders once a month, and when everything was said and done, they realized that they weren't being opened, leaders weren't reading it, so they decided to get rid of it. And when you get rid of something, then you open up staff capacity for doing something else. Two more resistance that you would, Dale.
So some of the categories across the top are objective, and some are very subjective. So I think to some degree you can predetermine what you're going to give a high ranking to, because you're going to see effective use of staff and volunteer time. That's pretty, that could be variable. Some of the things, financial results is clear. Percent of members used. Some are data-driven, which are much easier to then evaluate. But the ones that are subjective, if you know filling out this sheet that you think that program or service is a high priority in your head, you're going to rate that effective use of staff and volunteer time. And would we start today? Some of these things that are relatedness to mission, some of these things that are a little more squishy.
Yes, they are squishy.
Higher rankings too. So I'm wondering if some of these categories could have a little bit more objectivity put to them. Instead of effective use of staff and volunteer time, maybe some kind of objective criteria about percentage of time. I don't know. I'm just looking at this.
No, and it may be more comfortable for your organization if it's all data-driven. You can get numbers for all of these. So if there's no squishiness, and if that works better for your organization. I can tell you the one group that this doesn't work really super-duper well with is engineers. And I learned the hard way. And the reason is because they are extremely data-driven and they have a high need to be right. And I'm really happy every time I drive over a bridge. I'm really happy that structural engineers have a high need to be right. But this is not as comfortable. And honestly, sometimes it's just easier to do it internally and then present the results. But the other thing that you will have with leaders is you will have leaders that they're making the decisions based on what they think rather than what they know. So that data-driven stuff actually can be very enlightening for individuals. The other thing is there's because truthfully, this is just a tool. You could just have 3 columns if you wanted. And if you have 3 columns, it doesn't take you as long to do it. And you could just have 3 columns that have data. I think ideally you want to measure maybe on at least 5, because that's where your complexity starts shaking out, that this is rated high here and it's low here, and then where does it come out in the whole scheme of things? So absolutely, if that's more comfortable, and again, you know the culture of your group and you know your staff. So this can be, and you can just tell them, this is an exercise, we're just going to do this, we're going to have a conversation about it, we're going to see where it takes us. Keep in mind, though, why you're doing it to begin with. If you're doing it to try to reduce communications clutter, then I wouldn't do it if I wasn't serious about maybe getting rid of some things.
Have you seen this exercise have something different? I'm thinking of my own organization where I have such a disparity in ages of members that might skew the the vision of what those programs are and what's valuable to my older members is not valuable to my younger members, and how I would balance that so that I'm offering something.
Yeah, if I would, well, remember when you try to be all things to all people, you end up being nothing to anyone. So, but that's a whole nother seminar. I imagine that it probably would. If you were doing it by age group or segmenting, I imagine that it would be different. I haven't had anybody use it that way that I know of. But again, this is where I love this tool, because you can add to, you can change it, you can massage it, not necessarily to water it down or make it easier for you, but based on what you know. And I think that's a really interesting thought about using it. Adele.
So one question I just have is this idea of, okay, so you go through this exercise and it may work and you may get rid of some things. What is that potential next step? Is it we're going to replace it with X? Should you have some available programs that you're thinking of in advance of this exercise, just so that if you free up manpower and you free up resources, you have some ideas to offer? Otherwise, it could just be open season for any bad next golf outing.
Got it. Okay. So the question was, what's after this? Remember, this is a less is more, shrink to grow strategy. This isn't get rid of it so we can go replace it, unless it's get rid of the low performers so that we can bring in a high performer that is closely related to member value and it supports the value proposition. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is I think that this is a process you should be going through regularly. Maybe not every year, maybe every 3 years. I had one client that used it. They did a catalog of programs and services for members, and they had been carrying, the catalog just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and longer and longer and longer, and most of the programs and services weren't even used. But the board didn't want them to get rid of any, and so they went through this whole process, and they just told the board, we're going through a process, we are going to reduce the number of things in the catalog, and they ended up taking out a third of what was in the catalog, and the board never knew. Now, I'm not suggesting that you necessarily do that. If you can get away with it, go ahead. But I'm not suggesting that you be sneaky. I'm not suggesting that you lack transparency. But what this does help is if the board says to you, why'd you do that? You can say, it was part of a very strategic overall process to reduce our programs and services, to reduce our staffing, to reduce whatever it is. So have a reason when you're going in. And part of the reason, it will also, you can look and see where the value is. So the other thing that you might want to look for are orphans. So if you have this many things that fit into education, and this part fits into certification, this part fits into advocacy, and then you have a program or service that doesn't really fit into anything, I would be looking long and hard at that. Now, sometimes you'll have a cash cow, and you won't want to get rid of the cash cow because the cash cow pays your salary, because it funds the advocacy. But when you have those cash cows, I've seen associations say, this really doesn't fit with what we do. Let's spin it off. Let's sell it. So I've seen them sell insurance, a book of business to an insurance company, but they keep a revenue stream back to the association. Or maybe they sell their meeting, but they keep a revenue back to the association. So part of this is also to help you with strategy in terms of what you're going to be doing, but also what you're not going to be doing. So other resistance.
Not a resistance so much, but a challenge I would see potentially doing this, particularly if you're involving several staff in doing it, which I would recommend, would be as you're inventorying the list of programs and services, I think making sure you kind of lay out your criteria of what's going to go along those lines, because you always have the lumpers and the splitters, and you may have people that are going to put something really broad, a broad program. There's so many elements to it.
Well, advocacy doesn't count as you shouldn't write that on a line, because it's everything within advocacy. Your advocacy conference, your PAC fundraising, your government relations day on the Hill, your Say that again? Legislative breakfast. So exactly, that's exactly the kind of you're going to go. And that's the other way that you can use this too, is you can do it by department or by functional area and go in and do that. So you're right, you don't want to lump too much together. The other pushback I get on this is we are so busy as it is right now, we can't find time to do this. So if doing it for the whole association is too big, then my suggestion is there's a group in Ohio right now that they're doing it every other month. So they're going to do it 6 times, and they're doing it for 6 departments this year. And then next year they're going to pick up, they've got 8 departments total, and so they're going to do it for the remaining 2. Yes?
If you were to present the same matrix to, say, your board or another group of members and your staff, and there's a disparity between what those 2 groups come up with, do you automatically give more weight to what your members say because we're a membership organization, or is there a strategy for dealing with that?
The question is, if you give it to your board and you give it to your staff and the numbers are significantly different, who do you give more weight to? A part of it could be why you're doing it to begin with. If you're doing it to reduce communications clutter, then maybe you're going to give more weight to what your members say. But here's and this is where I think we have to be careful. As staff, generally, hopefully, we have a really nice grasp of what all of our programs and services are. And you have to be careful when you ask members to do this because they don't always have a similar knowledge level. Am I being tactful about that? I'm trying to be tactful about that. They don't have a similar knowledge level. So the only time I probably would use it with members is if it were a carefully selected group, if you were going to get them together in a room and have an opportunity to work through this process. Or if it's your board and you have the opportunity to do it at a retreat, although your board also knows more about the association than a general member does. But it really depends on why you're doing it. If you're doing it to try to right-size the organization or try to reduce your financial outlay, I think really it's best done with staff because it's a tool for you to figure out where you need to be putting your time. And here's the other thing. I don't think you have to, there's no magic number. You don't have to get rid of the bottom third, the bottom 20%. But how many of you just, what happens in Baltimore stays in Baltimore? How many of you have programs, just honestly, between us folks, how many of you have programs that are losing money? And how many of you have programs that are losing money and they've been losing money for quite a while? Okay. Why are we doing this? Okay. The bylaws are a legitimate excuse, but bylaws were also made to be changed. And here's something else that I think is interesting. Some of the groups that I work with, like their job title that they were created to serve, the job title is no longer in existence. So they're searching for meaning. They've got $9 million in revenue and they've got 20 staff members, and what board wants to just all of a sudden say, oh, let's close the association? You're not going to do that. But sometimes where you started and where you are now is really, really different. And so, if the bylaws tell you have to do it, but you're losing money on it, I think that's a great retreat question. Are the bylaws still relevant? Do we need to do some adjusting? Are we putting our focus in the right place? Is this meaningful? And truthfully, if you're losing money year after year, I think you really have to have some serious conversations about that. Because what's happening then is you're asking your strong performers to carry these money-losing spots. Steve?
Yeah, I think part of it, too, is that we get into this cycle, too, where you have to start working on the next year's thing. And, so time, it's just this horrible cycle you get in. So one of the things that that this has worked for us is for our products, evaluating our products, having a task force that does that and then makes a decision whether we're going to invest in it, redo it, divest in it, or just leave it until it's gone, and they're able to do that, pretty easily as sort of consumers of the product. Now, the interesting thing for us is we're going to be asking our board if we can take a year off of our summer courses next year to do more assessment around what we should be developing and what we should be divesting in. So it'll be interesting to see what they say, but we're actually saying we can't do all as much of this as we'd like to do, even if we do this tool, if we are already signing a contract for next summer's course a year ahead of time, where we're saying there's going to be 900 people sleeping in the hotel. How do we ever have a time to figure out what we should be doing or not doing when it comes, in particular, to live courses and programs? So I'll let you know how that goes next year.
That's interesting. Well, and some of it, you raise a good point. First of all, there's a time issue. If you're just management by deadline and you're just trying to get through the next meeting and the next annual conference and the next legislative breakfast, when do you find time to sit down and to do this? Number one, but there are those contractual obligations that you have, and so some of you already know where your meeting is. You've already signed a contract for 3 years, so. How do you drop the meeting? Well, you start now to drop it for 2018. So 2 more things I think that are helpful that are not related to this. But part of the reason we get into product bloat is that we don't evaluate on a regular basis. So my suggestion is that when you bring a new product on, that you set an automatic review date, just as standard policy. And, is that 2 years down the road? Is it 3 years down the road? And it might be different based on the type of program or service it is. A conference, it's not really fair to evaluate a conference 1 year after you've had the conference. You almost have to have a couple of years. So maybe if it's a conference, you're going to reevaluate after the second year, after the third year. So when a new program or service comes for approval, start putting in a review date. That automatically we know that in 2018, these are the 3 programs and services that we're going to evaluate. The other thing is, and Jamie, I think you're the one that your organization, you're the one that taught me to do this, or maybe not. Now that I'm looking at you, it may not be you. You can take credit for all the good stuff, right? A little pro forma that basically says, this is the new program, this is what we think it's going to cost, this is what we think it's going to take to market, this is how long we think it's going to take for us to get to the point where we're breaking even, and then this is what we think we're going to make or not make. So before you even go into it, essentially you're doing a micro business plan. A for-profit company would never ever start a program or service like associations do, where your member services committee comes together, and they come together to do what? They come together to do something for the association. So they get to the first meeting, and the chairman says, well, what kind of new member service can we add? Well, I don't know, but I'm a member of such and such, and they do blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay, well, let's do that. And then that committee, without any due diligence, without doing any research, without taking a look at any of the marketing potential, what kind of profit they can make on it, they say, yes, let's do it. It goes to the board. The board says, yes, let's do it. And then they dump it in your lap to make this a profitable program that nobody has taken a look at. You don't even know what the universe of potential users are. You don't even know if your members really even use this stuff or not. So I think that at the very minimum, we need to start having a little bit more discipline and a little bit more rigor around programs and services. And here's what's interesting. If you ask a committee to go to that trouble, all of a sudden the things that they feel very passionate about in a committee meeting will just magically go away, because they don't have the drive or the knowledge or the wherewithal. That's where staff, I think, can help in terms of knowing that there's a product or program or service. Staff can go back and help do the due diligence and bring the numbers back. That's what we need to really start taking a look at. I don't think you need to make money on everything that you do, but I do think it's a good idea not to lose money on everything you do. Last year I worked with an association that had $3 million in reserves. They, every July, were taking $1 million out of reserves to put into their operating fund, and then to help them get to the end of the year. So naively, I said, well, obviously you have a funding mechanism so that when the dues come in January, you're paying back your reserves. It's dead silence on the phone. And I said, I'm not really a great mathematician, but if you have $3 million in reserves and you borrowed $1 million last year and you're borrowing $1 million this year, the way I'm looking at it, you can't just keep losing money every year. And here's one of the challenges, and you know this because you work in the space. Board members turn over. And so it's really easy for them to push the problem to the next board and not take responsibility for it, and to leave us as staff members holding the bag. We also, I'm going to ask you to jot this down, we train people how to treat us. We train people how to treat us. And when we let them make decisions like that are not good for the association, and we don't push back politely and professionally, but really hard, it gets easier for them to continue to do that. And a lot of times we feel that it's our responsibility to do what the board wants, but you know that you have a responsibility not just to the board, you have a responsibility to your entire membership. So some of these policies and these processes will actually make it easier for you to make sure that you've got a value proposition, that you're not losing money, that you're not handcuffed by your bylaws, if that's the case. So I've got time for one more question or comment.
Yeah, so on life cycle position, how do you rank that in terms of 1 through 5? Because you may have something that you just started. How do you give that a favorable, unfavorable rating? What's your thought process?
If it were me doing it, I would give a high rating to something that's still at the early part of the life cycle because you have potential there. And the ones would be the things that are already on the decline. So give me an example of a program that when you introduced it, it went gangbusters. Dale.
Educational program for advanced practitioners.
Okay. Educational program for advanced practitioners. Where is it now? Is it on the decline? You're not having it?
Because it stopped producing revenue.
Okay.
We were servicing a small portion of the
Okay. So at the beginning, and you did it for 10 years. So at the beginning, that would be a 5, but then as you started to see that it was stopped producing revenue, fewer people were participating, it would drop down to a 1.
Not young or old.
No.
Whether it's decline or...
Exactly. And so if you Google life cycle position of a product, they'll show you a description of what that is, how it's coming in, how it's, exactly, and how it's going down.
Another question. Have you ever had a situation where people have come up and the rankings kind of averaged out and everything was kind of in the middle and there wasn't a high and there wasn't a low, and how you deal with that situation?
It means your value proposition stinks for the most part, and it means that you're vanilla and members don't come to you really for anything. I wouldn't say that it was like perfectly aligned, but certainly there are cases where, and I've actually had a case where I was working with the committee. There were a couple of things they couldn't find any 5s. So that tells you something too. And so for me, it's more about the process than it is really about where the numbers come out. It's the permission to look at things. It's the process that you have to look at things. It's the discipline that it takes to look at things. And for me, it's really about the conversations that come out of this. Here's the last thing I'll share with you. The way we change the future is to change the questions that we're asking today. And when you go through a process like this, in many cases, it just creates a whole lot of questions that you haven't asked before. But those questions are what's going to drive change and going to drive the future. And a whole lot of organizations that I'm working with are not asking the right questions. And in fact, they're not asking any questions at all. And some of them are also asking the wrong questions. And that's keeping their associations where they are. So if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. Thank you. Thank you.